It started like any other night in South Florida. Lights flashing, cameras rolling, celebrities moving through the city like nothing can touch them. But within minutes, everything flipped. Word spread fast across social media that Offset had been shot near a Casino Valet area in Hollywood, Florida. At first, nobody believed it. Then TMZ confirmed it. Then police statements followed, and suddenly timelines everywhere froze. A man who helped define a generation of rap music, now in a hospital bed fighting to recover. And just like that, hip-hop went into full reaction mode. The first wave hit instantly. Fans in shock, blogs going crazy. Then the artists started speaking. And what they said or didn't say told a story deeper than the headlines. Quavo, Offset's longtime Migos brother, posted nothing but a prayer emoji. No words. Just silence and symbolism. And that alone was enough to shake the internet. Because everyone remembers the history, the tension, the broken moments, and the fact that after Takeoff's death, nothing between them was ever truly the same. Cardi B, Offset's estranged wife, was reportedly alerted immediately. No public statements at first, just concern behind the scenes as the situation unfolded in real time involving the father of her children. Then came the culture voices. Artists, producers, and even unexpected names like Ric Flair stepping in with public prayers, reminding everyone how far Offset's influence stretched beyond just hip-hop. But not every reaction was calm. Some figures in the media space rushed to speculate. Others turned it into content within minutes. And once again, the internet showed the same pattern. It mourns and it performs at the same time. And then there was the chaos factor. Voices like 6ix9ine showing up online in the middle of tragedy, turning a serious moment into controversy, sparking outrage across the culture. But underneath all of it, one question kept repeating everywhere. How did it get to this point? Again? Because this isn't just about a shooting. This is about history repeating itself. About fame, violence, loyalty, betrayal, and a rap world that keeps getting pulled back into the same cycle no matter how many times it promises change. And as Offset lay in the hospital, stable but shaken, the industry wasn't just reacting anymore. It was remembering. To really understand why Offset's shooting sent shockwaves through the entire hip-hop world, you can't look at it like an isolated incident. It didn't happen in a vacuum. It landed in the middle of a story that's been building for over a decade. A story filled with success, brotherhood, tension, tragedy, and constant reinvention. Offset isn't just another rapper. He's 1/3 of Migos, one of the most influential rap groups of the last generation. Alongside Quavo and the late Takeoff, Offset helped shape the sound of modern trap music in a way that still echoes through today's charts. From ad-libs to flow patterns to the way hooks are structured in rap now, Migos didn't just participate in the culture, they changed it. Their rise started in Atlanta, a city already rich with musical innovation, but Migos brought something different. It wasn't polished in the traditional sense. It was rhythmic, unpredictable, and heavily reliant on chemistry. That chemistry came from something deeper than music. It came from real-life connection. Quavo and Takeoff were uncle and nephew. Offset was the third piece that completed the triangle, and together they built an identity that felt bigger than individual fame. When Versace dropped, the industry took notice. When Bad and Bougé hit #1, it wasn't just a hit song, it was a cultural takeover. Memes, dance trends, radio dominance, award show recognition. Migos had crossed from Atlanta streets into global pop culture, and at the center of that wave was Offset, whose cadence and energy often pushed tracks into viral territory. But behind the success, cracks were forming long before the public fully realized it. Fame changes dynamics, especially when it grows fast. Creative differences, interpersonal relationships, and external pressures began to shape the group in different directions. Offset's solo ambitions started to rise. Quavo and Takeoff leaned into their own creative bond. The unity that once defined Migos slowly became more complicated, even if the public didn't immediately see the full extent of it. Then came the turning point that no one in hip-hop could ever prepare for. Takeoff's death in 2022. That moment didn't just affect Migos, it affected the entire culture. Takeoff wasn't just a rapper, he was widely respected as one of the most effortless and technically skilled artists of his generation. His death at a private event in Houston shattered the illusion that success protects anyone from violence. It reminded the world that fame doesn't create distance from real-life danger. It sometimes puts a spotlight on it. For Offset and Quavo, it was devastating on a personal level. They weren't just group members anymore, they were survivors of something unimaginable. And in the immediate aftermath, many expected grief to bring them closer together again. But grief doesn't always heal fractures, it can expose them. Public appearances, interviews, and social media moments showed that the relationship between surviving members was complicated. There were attempts at unity, including emotional performances and tribute appearances, but underneath that, tension still lingered. Years of personal disagreements, business separation, and emotional strain didn't disappear just because of shared loss. Meanwhile, Offset was navigating a completely different chapter of his life. His marriage to Cardi B became one of the most public relationships in music. It was glamorous, chaotic, emotional, and constantly under public scrutiny. Breakups, reconciliations, public apologies, viral moments. Every stage of their relationship played out in front of millions. And through it all, they built a family, raising children while balancing careers that never slowed down. At the same time, Offset was also carving out his identity as a solo artist. While Migos had defined him, he was actively trying to prove he could stand alone. Collaborations with major artists, solo projects, and charting hits all helped establish him beyond the group identity. But no matter how far he moved, the shadow of Migos, and especially the absence of Takeoff, never fully left his story. That context matters because by the time of the Florida incident, Offset wasn't just another celebrity moving through a casino. He was a high-profile figure carrying years of layered history, both personal and professional. Every public appearance comes with visibility, and visibility in hip-hop often comes with risk. The setting itself, Hollywood, Florida, inside a casino environment, added another layer of unpredictability. Casinos are places of high energy, money flow, and constant movement. Celebrities often pass through unnoticed, but they also stand out in ways that can quickly escalate situations. When gunfire enters that kind of space, even briefly, it creates instant chaos and confusion. What made this situation even more intense for the public was how quickly information spread without clarity. In the modern internet era, news doesn't arrive fully formed. It arrives in fragments, tweets, leaks, police confirmations, insider claims, and social media speculation all merging at once. Within minutes, narratives start forming before facts are even fully confirmed. And in Offset's case, that meant the hip-hop world was reacting emotionally before they even had a complete understanding of what happened. That's why reactions poured in so fast. Artists weren't just responding to an event, they were responding to fear, memory, and trauma from previous losses. Takeoff's death was still fresh in the collective memory of the culture. Every new incident involving a major artist reopens that wound, whether people realize it or not. So when Offset was confirmed to be injured, even if not critically, the reaction wasn't just concern, it was exhaustion. Exhaustion from a pattern that hip-hop has been dealing with for decades. Violence, retaliation, misunderstanding, speculation, and tragedy repeating in cycles that never fully break. At the same time, hip-hop as an industry has evolved into a space where reactions themselves become part of the story. A prayer emoji can trend. A silence can be analyzed. A comment can spark debates. Every artist's response becomes content, and every piece of content becomes part of the narrative surrounding the incident. That's what makes this moment so layered. Offset's shooting isn't just about one night or one location. It sits at the intersection of fame, history, grief, and a culture that processes tragedy in real time through millions of voices. And as the background of his life, his group, and his relationships all collide into this moment, the industry is left asking not just what happened, but why it keeps happening at all. At first, The story sounded like another sudden burst of violence in a place where nobody expected it. A casino valet area, a normal evening crowd, flashing lights, luxury cars pulling in and out, people focused on entertainment, not danger. Then, in an instant, everything shifted. Shots fired, panic, confusion. And within minutes, one of rap's biggest names, Offset, was linked to the chaos. But what turned this from a simple breaking news story into a full-blown cultural explosion wasn't just the shooting itself. It was what came after, when the conflicting details, the unanswered questions, and the rapid-fire reactions from people who seemed to know more than they were saying. Because almost immediately, the narrative stopped being clear. Some reports suggested a targeted altercation. Others hinted at a spontaneous escalation. Then came the whispers online. Claims of a personal dispute, rumors of money issues, and even speculation about who was actually involved in the situation. The internet did what it always does in moments like this. It filled in the blanks before the truth could catch up. And that's where the first real twist hit the culture. Instead of a clean, simple explanation, what emerged was a tangled web of overlapping stories. Different voices started pointing in different directions. Some said it was a chance encounter gone wrong. Others insisted it was tied to an ongoing tension that had been brewing long before that night. Suddenly, Offset wasn't just a victim in a random act of violence. He was being pulled into a narrative that was far more complicated. The confusion only intensified when early statements from authorities confirmed very little beyond the basic facts. There had been an incident, there was an injury, and people were detained. That silence created a vacuum, and in that vacuum, speculation grew louder than reality. Online, the conversation split into factions. One group focused on concern and recovery, waiting for updates about Offset's condition. Another group began analyzing every possible angle of the situation, trying to reconstruct what happened from fragments of information. And then there was the third group, the one that always emerges in these situations. People turning tragedy into content, commentary, and debate within minutes. But the real turning point came when rumors started linking the incident to a deeper personal conflict involving multiple names in the hip-hop ecosystem. That's when the story stopped being just about a shooting. It started becoming about relationships, history, and unresolved tension. Whispers of past disagreements resurfaced. Old interviews were clipped and reposted. Social media users began connecting dots between past disputes and present speculation. Nothing was confirmed, but in the digital age, confirmation is no longer required for a narrative to take shape. Perception becomes reality faster than facts can intervene. And as that narrative spread, the emotional temperature of the entire hip-hop community rose, because Offset isn't just another artist in the system. And he's a core figure in one of the most influential groups of the modern era. Any incident involving him automatically carries weight, not just because of his fame, but because of everything he represents. Success, survival, legacy, and the complicated history of Migos. That's when the first emotional fracture appeared in the public response. Fans weren't just reacting to a shooting anymore. They were reacting to the fear of losing another major figure in a culture that has already endured too many losses. Takeoff's death was still a fresh wound in the collective memory of hip-hop. Every new violent incident involving a major artist doesn't start from zero. It starts from the last tragedy that never fully healed. So when Offset's name entered the conversation, people didn't just see breaking news, they saw continuity, a pattern, and a repetition of something the culture has been trying and failing to escape. And then came the second wave of disruption, the reactions from within the industry itself. Artists, producers, and media personalities began responding in real time. Some offered prayers. Some expressed shock. Some stayed silent. But even silence became part of the conversation. In modern hip-hop, not reacting is also interpreted as reacting. Every absence is noticed. Every delay is analyzed. Quavo's response in particular became a focal point, almost instantly. A simple gesture, a prayer emoji, no long statement, no explanation, just a symbol. But in a situation layered with history, that symbol carried enormous weight. Because the relationship between Quavo and Offset has been one of the most complicated and publicly scrutinized dynamics in music. Once inseparable collaborators, their bond had gone through visible strain in recent years, especially after personal and professional fractures within Migos. So, when Quavo's reaction appeared, it wasn't just seen as sympathy, it was dissected for meaning. Was it reconciliation? Was it distance? Was it restraint? Or was it simply grief expressed in the only way he could manage at that moment? The internet couldn't agree, and that disagreement became part of the story. But the first real twist, the moment that shifted everything from confusion to cultural explosion, wasn't just about Quavo. It was about how quickly the situation spiraled beyond control of any single narrative. Because as official updates remained limited, unofficial voices filled the gap. Media commentators began speculating. Social platforms amplified every rumor. Clips, live streams, and posts began forming a parallel version of the event. One that often contradicted itself, but spread faster than verified information ever could. And in that chaos, something familiar happened again in hip-hop culture. Truth and speculation became indistinguishable for a period of time. People started attaching meaning to things that had no confirmation. Past tensions were reintroduced as evidence. Old industry stories were revived and reframed as explanations. Even unrelated events were pulled into the orbit of the incident, as if everything had to connect somehow. That's when the emotional reaction shifted again, from concern to intensity. Because now it wasn't just Offset was shot. It became, what really led to this? And that question changed everything. It turned the situation into a puzzle the internet felt entitled to solve. Every detail became a clue. Every silence became suspicious. Every rumor became a possible answer. The story was no longer anchored in facts. It was being driven by interpretation. Meanwhile, behind all of this online chaos, Offset's reality was very different. He wasn't a trending topic or a debate thread. He was a man dealing with physical injury, medical attention, and immediate uncertainty. The disconnect between real-life recovery and internet narrative became one of the most striking contrasts of the entire situation. But the public didn't slow down. Instead, the speculation escalated further when secondary claims began circulating, suggesting deeper involvement of other figures and potential prior disputes. Now, some of these claims were later questioned or contradicted, but by then they had already done their job. They had expanded the story beyond a single incident into a multi-layered controversy. That is the second twist inside the first major conflict. The realization that this wasn't going to stay a simple shooting story. It was going to become a cultural investigation, part fact, part rumor, part emotional projection from a community still processing loss after loss. And at the center of it all, Offset's name became more than just a headline. It became a symbol of how quickly fame, violence, history, and speculation can collide in real time. By the time the first official confirmation settled, the narrative had already evolved beyond control. The story had split into multiple versions depending on who you asked, what you saw, and when you entered the conversation. And that fragmentation is what defines this entire moment, because in hip-hop, the first twist isn't always the truth. Sometimes the first twist is the moment the story stops belonging to reality and starts belonging to the internet. By the time the first wave of confusion started settling, the situation had already evolved into something far bigger than a single incident outside a casino. What began as breaking news was now turning into a full-blown cultural storm, one that kept expanding every hour, pulling in more names, more theories, and more tension than anyone expected. Because in hip-hop, once a story gains momentum like this, it rarely slows down. It escalates, and that's exactly what happened here. As Offset remained in medical care and officials continued releasing only limited information, the internet didn't wait. It moved ahead of the facts again. New claims started surfacing across social media platforms, each one more intense than the last. Some suggested the incident was tied to a personal disagreement. Others hinted at a financial dispute. And a few even began connecting Offset's presence at the location to other industry figures who may or may not have been involved. None of it was confirmed, but it didn't matter anymore. The story had entered its escalation phase. And that's when the tone shifted from shock to suspicion. People started replaying old moments, interviews, and social media posts as if they contained hidden meaning. Every past tension Offset had ever been linked to suddenly got re-examined under a new lens. Old industry rumors resurfaced. Past disagreements were reframed as possible motives. Even unrelated celebrity interactions were dragged into the conversation as the internet attempted to build a timeline that made sense of something still officially unclear. But the more people tried to solve it, the more complicated it became. And then came the first major shockwave. A wave of unverified insider-style claims began circulating, suggesting that the situation at the casino may not have been random at all. Instead, some online voices began pushing the idea that there had been a prior connection between individuals present that night. That suggestion alone was enough to send the conversation spiraling again. Because if true, even partially, it would change everything. Now it wouldn't just be an incident. It would be a confrontation with history attached to it. That's when the emotional intensity skyrocketed. Fans who were previously just concerned began demanding clarity. Comment sections turned into debates. Live streams turned into breakdown sessions. Every new post was dissected like evidence in a trial. The culture wasn't just reacting anymore, it was investigating, arguing, and emotionally exhausting itself in real time. And while all of this was happening online, the real-world situation remained painfully simple. Offset was recovering, authorities were still investigating, and verified details were limited. But simplicity never survives long in a digital storm. The escalation hit another level when industry commentary began pouring in. Media personalities and hip-hop commentators started offering their interpretations, each trying to make sense of the chaos. Some framed it as an unfortunate but isolated incident. Others hinted at deeper industry tensions, and a few took a more cautious stance, warning that premature narratives were spreading faster than facts. But even those warnings couldn't slow the momentum, because once a narrative reaches critical mass online, it develops its own engine. And that engine was now running full speed. Then came the second shock layer. The reactions from inside the hip-hop ecosystem itself began revealing something unexpected. Division. Not everyone was responding the same way. Some artists kept it strictly emotional, focusing on prayers and recovery. Others remained completely silent, which only fueled more speculation. And a smaller group of voices approached it with analysis rather than emotion, discussing what the situation reflected about the broader culture rather than the specific incident. But the most noticeable shift came from how quickly people began referencing past tragedies. Offset's name didn't exist in isolation in this moment. It was immediately connected to the memory of Takeoff. That connection changed the emotional weight of everything. Even though the incidents were not directly related, the association alone intensified public reaction. Because in the eyes of many fans, hip-hop has been here before. Too many times. And that memory created escalation on its own. Every new update didn't just feel like information, it felt like déjà vu. And then came the moment that truly shocked the public conversation. A wave of commentary began suggesting that the incident might involve more than just random violence or an isolated confrontation. Some voices online began implying that there were multiple layers to what happened. Layers involving personal history, business tension, and unresolved disputes that had never fully reached public understanding. These claims were not verified. Authorities did not confirm them, but they spread anyway. And that spread changed the tone completely. Now the conversation wasn't just what happened, it became what has been happening underneath everything we didn't see. That's when escalation turned into full-blown speculation warfare. Different narratives began competing for dominance. One version painted the situation as an unfortunate escalation of an in-person dispute, and another suggested a more structured sequence of events involving prior communication and planning. A third rejected both and insisted it was a chaotic, unpredictable moment with no deeper meaning at all. All three versions existed at the same time, and all three had supporters. But the shocking reveal wasn't a single confirmed detail. It was the realization that there would not be an immediate, clean explanation. That uncertainty itself became the twist, because the more people looked for clarity, the more they realized how fragmented the early information truly was. Even basic questions, who was directly involved, what triggered the confrontation, how events unfolded in sequence, remained unanswered publicly. And that gap between certainty and uncertainty became the space where escalation lived. Meanwhile, Offset's condition became another emotional anchor point for the public. Updates confirming he was stable helped ease immediate fears, but they didn't calm the broader storm. Instead, they created a strange emotional contradiction. Relief mixed with unresolved tension. People were grateful he survived, but unsettled by everything surrounding the incident. That emotional contradiction fueled even more discussion. Because survival didn't end the story, it extended it. Now the focus shifted from what happened to Offset to why did it happen at all? And that question reopened every speculative angle again. As the hours passed, even more voices entered the conversation, some attempting to clarify, others unintentionally adding more confusion. The situation became layered with overlapping interpretations, that each one claiming to bring insight but often adding another layer of uncertainty instead. That's when the shocking reveal of the escalation phase truly landed. There was no single narrative holding everything together. Instead, there were multiple competing versions of the same event, each shaped by timing, perspective, and incomplete information. And in that realization, the story transformed again. It was no longer just about a shooting. It was about how quickly modern fame turns real-life crisis into fragmented storytelling, where truth competes with speculation, and the loudest narrative often arrives before the most accurate one. By the end of this phase, one thing was undeniable. The situation had moved beyond breaking news. It had become a living controversy, still unfolding, still being rewritten, yes, and still pulling the entire hip-hop world deeper into its uncertainty with every passing hour. Once the news fully settled into the public consciousness, the reaction wasn't just immediate, it was massive, layered, and emotionally split in every possible direction. This wasn't one unified response, it was hundreds of thousands of reactions happening at the same time, all shaped by personal history, industry loyalty, grief, and speculation. And that's what made this moment feel so heavy. Because Offset isn't just a rapper to the public, he's part of a cultural era that shaped modern hip-hop. So when his name became tied to a shooting incident, the reaction didn't stay small or contained. It exploded across every corner of entertainment, sports, media, and social platforms. The first wave was pure shock. Fans flooded timelines with disbelief. Many refused to accept the initial reports until confirmations came in. Even then, the tone was emotional confusion. Relief that he was stable mixed with fear about how something like this could happen in the first place. For many, it wasn't just about Offset the artist, but Offset the father, the husband, the member of Migos, and the surviving thread of a group already marked by tragedy. That emotional layer is important, because in hip-hop, public reaction is never just about music, it's about memory. And the memory of Takeoff's death was still fresh in the culture. So when Offset's situation surfaced, people didn't react in isolation. They reacted through that existing emotional scar. Every new headline felt like a reminder that violence continues to follow, even the most successful names in the industry. Then came the artist reactions. Within minutes and hours, figures across the music world began responding in real time. Some kept it simple: prayer emojis, short messages, or reposted updates. Others wrote longer statements expressing concern, gratitude that he survived, and frustration at how often these situations continue to happen in hip-hop. Quavo's reaction stood out immediately. A single prayer emoji. No explanation, no elaboration, just silence wrapped in symbolism. But in the context of their history, that silence spoke louder than words. Fans immediately dissected it, not because it was dramatic, but because it was restrained. It reflected everything the two had been through: years of collaboration, yet public tension, shared success, personal distance, and the emotional weight of losing takeoff. People didn't just see a reaction, they saw a relationship compressed into one symbol, and that's why it went viral instantly. Meanwhile, Cardi B's connection to Offset added another emotional layer to the public response. Even though their relationship had seen ups and downs, separations and reconciliations, and eventually legal separation proceedings, they share children and a long public history. That meant her response, though largely private at first, became a subject of intense public attention. People weren't just asking what happened to Offset, they were asking what this meant for everyone connected to him. That's how deeply this moment penetrated pop culture. But the industry reactions didn't stop at emotional support. They expanded into reflection. Producers, DJs, and media personalities began discussing what this incident represented in a broader sense. Many pointed out that hip-hop continues to exist in a strange contradiction. It is the most influential genre in the world, yet still constantly affected by real-life violence that overshadows its achievements. Some industry voices focused on fatigue, a sense of emotional exhaustion, the feeling that every few years the culture is forced to process another major incident involving violence, recovery, grief, or loss. And even when artists survive, the emotional impact lingers long after the headlines fade. Others focused on accountability within the ecosystem itself. Questions began circulating about safety, environments artists move through, and the unpredictable nature of celebrity visibility. In casinos, clubs, private events, places that are meant to be entertainment spaces, suddenly became focal points in the discussion about how quickly situations can escalate when fame and public access collide. And then there were the more controversial reactions. Certain online personalities and commentators rushed to speculate, analyze, and sometimes exaggerate details before they were confirmed. This created tension between those seeking clarity and those criticizing the rush to turn a serious incident into content. The divide was clear. One side wanted information, the other side wanted engagement, and Offset's situation became the center of that conflict. Even outside the music industry, public figures from sports and entertainment chimed in. Some expressed genuine concern. Others referenced their own experiences with sudden violence or near-miss situations in public life. The reaction wasn't limited to hip-hop. It became a wider cultural conversation about safety, fame, and unpredictability in modern celebrity life. But perhaps the most telling part of the public reaction was what happened on social media platforms. Because there, the response fractured into three distinct emotional categories. The first group was purely supportive. Fans posting prayers, memories, and messages of encouragement. This group focused on Offset as a human being, not just a celebrity. The second group was analytical. People trying to reconstruct timelines, interpret reports, and understand how events unfolded. They treated the situation like a puzzle that needed solving. The third group was chaotic, those spreading rumors, reacting emotionally without confirmation, or turning the situation into commentary content almost immediately. All three groups existed simultaneously, and all three shaped the narrative. But underneath all of it was a shared emotional thread: concern. Even when people disagreed, even when speculation got out of hand, even when narratives conflicted, the underlying tone was that another major figure in hip-hop had been involved in violence, and that reality itself was becoming too familiar. That familiarity is what made this reaction different from ordinary celebrity news. It wasn't just surprise, it was recognition. Recognition of a pattern the culture has seen too many times before. As the hours passed, updates confirming Offset's stable condition helped calm immediate fears, but they didn't reduce the intensity of discussion. Instead, they shifted the focus. Now, people weren't reacting to danger, they were reacting to meaning. What does this say about the industry? What does this say about safety? What does this say about how fame interacts with risk? Those questions became central to every discussion thread, every commentary video, and every social post analyzing the situation. And even as new voices entered the conversation, one thing remained constant. nobody was treating this as just another story, because it wasn't. It was a moment that reminded the entire industry how fragile the line is between celebration and crisis. And in that space between the two, the public reaction became more than noise. It became a reflection of an industry still trying to process its own reality, one headline at a time. Not just when it felt like the situation was starting to stabilize. The story took another turn that nobody saw coming. At first, everything pointed toward a relatively contained incident. Offset had been injured, treated, and confirmed to be stable. Authorities were continuing their investigation, and the public had started shifting from panic to cautious relief. The worst seemed to be over. But in the world of modern hip-hop news, stories rarely end where they begin. They evolve. And this one evolved fast. As investigators continued piecing together the timeline from surveillance footage, witness statements, and on-site reports, inconsistencies started surfacing in the public narrative. Details that were widely shared online didn't fully align with the official early descriptions. That gap between online speculation and verified reporting became the first sign that there was still more beneath the surface. And then came the twist that reignited everything. Late-night commentary from prominent hip-hop media voices suggested that Offset's presence at the location may have been tied to more than just a casual appearance. While official sources remained careful and limited in their statements, online discussion began circling around the idea that the meeting or encounter that night had layers of prior context that the public wasn't fully aware of. That alone was enough to set the internet back on fire. Because it changed the framing completely, what was once being viewed as a sudden incident now started being discussed as something with a deeper backstory. Something that may have involved prior tension, unresolved issues, or overlapping personal and professional dynamics. Nothing was confirmed, but perception had already shifted again. And once perception shifts, the entire story shifts with it. The second shock came from the way the industry began reacting differently in hindsight. Earlier responses had focused on shock and concern, but now some voices began reevaluating what they initially thought they knew. Interviews, live stream discussions, and commentary clips started revisiting earlier assumptions and asking whether the full picture had been visible from the beginning. This is where the story became more complicated than a simple incident report, because suddenly people weren't just reacting to what happened. They were questioning how it happened, and why so many versions of the story existed at the same time. And at the center of it all, Offset remained in recovery, largely out of the public eye. But his situation had already become bigger than his immediate condition. It had turned into a cultural event that was still unfolding in real time, shaped by every new rumor, every new analysis, and every new interpretation. Then came the most emotionally charged part of the entire situation. A wave of commentary began connecting this incident back to the larger emotional history surrounding Migos, particularly the loss of Takeoff. Even without direct connection to the events of that night, the association resurfaced powerfully in public conversation. Because for many people, this wasn't just about Offset alone, it was about the fragile thread that still holds together a legacy marked by success and tragedy. And that emotional connection added weight to every new update. As speculation continued, another layer of uncertainty entered the conversation. Claims and counterclaims about who was actually present, what the exact sequence of events was, and how quickly the situation escalated once it began. Different sources and online voices presented conflicting interpretations, each adding to the confusion rather than resolving it. The result was a fractured narrative landscape. No single version of events dominated completely. Instead, multiple competing stories circulated at once, and that fragmentation became the real final twist. Because the shocking truth wasn't a single hidden detail or dramatic revelation, it was the realization that the full truth was still not publicly visible. Even after hours of coverage, reaction, and analysis, yet the core of what actually happened remained partially obscured. And that uncertainty is what kept the story alive. Meanwhile, the cultural impact continued expanding outward. Artists still processed the news in waves. Fans continued debating interpretations. Commentators continued analyzing every fragment of information. and social media continued amplifying every new angle, whether verified or speculative. But underneath all of it, a quieter realization began to settle in. This wasn't just another headline cycle. It was another reminder of how quickly real-life danger and public narrative collide in the age of instant information, where truth moves slowly, but reaction moves instantly. And in that gap between the two, stories grow, shift, and sometimes lose their original shape entirely. Yet as the night of coverage turned into the next day of reflection, one thing remained unresolved. What exactly led to that moment outside the casino? And just as importantly, what hasn't been revealed yet? Because even though Offset's condition brought relief and the immediate danger had passed, the story itself was far from over. New updates were still expected, more details were still emerging behind the scenes, and different voices were still preparing to speak, meaning the situation wasn't closing. It was widening, and the biggest twist of all wasn't what had already been revealed. It was the fact that the final answer still hadn't arrived. So now everything is on the table. The shock, the confusion, the reactions, and the unanswered questions that are still hanging in the air. Offset is reported to be stable, but the conversation around what happened is nowhere near over. And honestly, this is the part where the internet decides what happens next. Because every story like this doesn't just end with updates. It continues through discussion, opinions, and how people choose to respond. This moment isn't just about one incident anymore, it's about a bigger pattern that hip-hop keeps facing over and over again. Fans, artists, and commentators are all reacting in real time, but the real impact comes from what people take away from it once the headlines fade. That's where your voice comes in too. What do you think really led to the situation? Was it just random chaos like some are saying, or is there something deeper that people still haven't fully understood yet? And more importantly, do you think the culture is finally at a point where change is actually possible? Or are we just watching the same cycle repeat itself under different headlines? Because one thing is clear, every reaction matters. Every comment, every discussion, every share keeps the conversation alive. And when the hip-hop community speaks, the industry listens, whether it's about safety, unity, or accountability. So drop your thoughts below and be part of the conversation. Not just as a viewer, but as someone who actually cares about where this culture is headed next. Agree or disagree, it all adds to the bigger picture. And if you want more deep breakdowns like this, covering the stories behind the headlines, the reactions, and the moments that shake the industry, make sure you stay connected, stay updated, and stay tuned in. Because stories like this don't end when the news stops. They end when people stop talking about them. And right now, nobody's done talking yet.